Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning. I'm Martha Rogers, and I'll be the host and moderator for this morning's panel on ethical perspectives on the news. Oh, there's been a lot of emotional hot-button topics in the news in the last couple of months, but one that doesn't seem to go away is one I think we'll have time to explore and focus on this morning. It's been in the political ads, it's been in the news, and the topic that we're going to look at is immigration. It evokes a lot of emotional responses from us. It evokes a lot of opinions of pro and con on the ways to approach it, what our actions are and what our attitudes. So I hope that you, along with myself, will learn lots from the panel that we've assembled this morning. We have three professionals with us that have a lot to share, and I'd like to introduce them to you at this time. Sitting next to me is Lynda Barrow, Professor of Political Science at Coe College. Welcome, Lynda.
Thank you. It's
nice
good
to
be
have
here.
you here. And sitting next to Lynda is Ray Scheetz, an attorney in Cedar Rapids who has some expertise and some practice in this area also.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for being here, Ray. And rounding out our panel is Ann Naffier. Ann's come to us from Des Moines this morning, and she's with the program called Justice for Our Neighbors.
Good morning.
Good morning. And let's start with you. What is Justice for Our Neighbors?
Well, Justice for Our Neighbors is a statewide nonprofit organization that provides free legal assistance and representation to low-income immigrants throughout Iowa. So I'm here because I am the attorney who works with the Cedar Rapids site. We come to Cedar Rapids once a month, and we see any low-income immigrants, or as many as we can, who need immigration assistance, evaluate cases, and take on as many cases as we can. We are associated with the United Methodist Church, and so we do come from a faith-based background, although I want to be clear that we are not evangelical in any way. We serve all immigrants regardless of their religion, and we don't have any kind of requirement for them to attend a church or anything like that to be served by us.
So all three of you have some practical experience in this field. What's happening with immigration, migration? When I was doing research for today's panel, they use those two words interchangeably. Let's start right there. Oh, I know about migration with birds, but I'm not that familiar about migration with people and immigration.
Well, because I'm a lawyer and I practice immigration law, I can tell you what's been happening with the immigration laws, and that is nothing. It's such, as you said, it's such a hot button topic. There's no agreement. There's very little agreement, and when very little agreement exists, everything stays as is. And for a lot of people, the status quo isn't working, but nobody can agree how to fix it. And so that's the status of immigration.
So does that mean, from a legal standpoint, that we're using some archaic policies, or?
I think it's not necessarily an archaic policy, it's one of willful blindness. We are making ourselves blind. When I say we, I'm talking about Americans. We are willfully blinding ourselves to the fact that there's something around between 12 to 15 million undocumented people in the United States, and those are all ages. And so nobody seems to be able to agree as to how to process, how to incorporate the people into tax-paying persons.
And contributing members of society.
Well, I didn't use that word intentionally because 99% of non-immigrant or undocumented people do contribute to society. They just, they're not lawbreakers, they're hardworking, they have families, they own things, but they can't become legal. And so in that sense of the word, yes, they can't contribute, but they contribute in so many other ways.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Well, I would add it's not just the question of the undocumented, but immigration in general. When you say people are split, the American public is split as well. split as to whether there should be a path to legalization or whether those folks have to go home first. Split as to whether immigration as a whole is good for this country. I mean, currently, about 1 in 7 people in this country was born elsewhere. And yet we're fairly divided on whether we think in general it's a good thing.
And I would just say, you know, this is in putting it in a global perspective. We're at a time in our world's history in which we have more immigrants than we ever have in the past. So we have a law which does not move very well with the times, which really doesn't meet the needs of the United States, either the immigrants or our economy. And we have that law in the midst of a world in which we have more immigration than ever. So we really do need to update our way of dealing with it.
So that makes the issue even more complicated in my thinking, because we look at immigration with people and families legally, illegally, but then I wonder too, is immigration a matter of choice? Is it a matter of survival with all the unrest in the world? What do some of your experiences
Well,
say
I would
about
agree that, you know, there are different kinds. There are voluntary and involuntary. There are people. Most of the voluntary migrants are probably for family reunification or perhaps to seek a better economic future. But the involuntary can be refugees as well as people who are trafficked.
I always talk about in my presentations about the push-pull factors, right? There are factors that are pushing people out of their countries. Most people are not adventurers. Many people are, and they love doing that, but most people leave their countries, they pick up and leave, often forever, because they are forced to. So it's either political problems, they have a war, or there are economic problems, or there are environmental problems, and I think we're going to see that more as climate change affects many areas where many people live. But for some reason, they are pushed out of the country. They're pushed out of the place where they're living because they're not able to make a living. They're not able to support their families. They're not able to do what they want to do with their lives there. And then what pulls them to the United States specifically, you know, despite what we say about, you know, people, Americans not having jobs and things like that, the truth is there are jobs for these people. They come because there are jobs for the people who come to the United States. That's a big thing that pulls them there. Another big thing that pulls people to the United States is they already have family members here. We've been taking in immigrants for many, many years, and many of them are not so far along in their development here in the United States that they haven't lost ties with people back in their home countries. Sometimes it's very close ties. Sometimes it's their spouses and their parents and their children, and sometimes it's, you know, cousins and neighbors and nephews and nieces and things like that. Many of them, of course, come illegally. The reason they come unregulated is because there are no immigration programs that they can come with. There's this myth that all people have to do is just go home and get in line. If they would just go home and get in line and not jump in front of everybody else, it would be okay, we would be fine with you. And the truth is there is no line for people to get into, which is why you have a lot of people coming here. There's something for them here, there's nothing for them, or there's danger for them back home. Their choice sometimes is a life and death choice, so the fact that there was no specific line for them to get into is overshadowed by the fact that they have to be here, and so they come undocumented.
So when you say there's no line for them, is that from the legal perspective?
Sure.
That there's no line for them to get into access?
Well, let me, and Ray, I think, would agree, and I'm an attorney as well. The line, I mean, there are certain lines. There are people who apply for employment-based visas because usually they're people with a high degree of education, maybe in a STEM field, science, technology, something like that. But they have to wait because there's so many people who are coming in with those kinds of skills that they have to wait their turn to be able to come in. Or you have family-based immigration. You have someone who can apply for, it's not very wide. You can't apply for your nephews or nieces or grandparents or anything like that, but you can, someone who's here as a U.S. citizen can apply for their parents or their children, spouse, siblings. So those people, but there are long lines for those areas. So for instance, the sibling, a brother or sister of a U.S. citizen, say from Mexico, is going to wait at least 15 years maybe. It's been 12 for a long time, but a very, very long time before they can come. So there is that kind of a waiting line. But if you're a person in Mexico, say, who just wants to make a better life for yourself, but you didn't go to college, you're not an engineer, and you don't have family who have been here before, at least not very close family who have been here before, There's no line for that kind of a person. There's no line for the kind of people like my ancestors who came over, who simply came over to make a better life for themselves.
Again, there is a line, but as you said, it's a very, very long line for most people.
Not for people who don't have family or employment-based options. There's no specific line just to come over because you want to come over, or because, or you know, because you feel the need to come over. Do you think there is some sort of a line?
Yes, yes.
What would that line be?
It's the line where people line up outside the U.S. embassies in various countries, and the line is blocks and blocks long in the places like the Philippines and so on. Yes, there are very long lines.
And those lines, I mean, the only lines I can imagine, Ray, help me here, the only lines I can imagine would be people applying for visitor visas, because people lining up in lines would not be eligible for any kind of actual immigrant, like being able to come and live in the United States.
What, can we make an assumption that there are the regulations for those who go through the legal channels for employment or for illness and family reunification? But I think when I hear it on the news or with all the political candidates that are vying for a nomination now, am I assuming correctly when I assume that the hot button of it is the illegal immigration?
Well, right now also refugee status is huge. Not so big for the United States because we're not contiguous to, well, Central Americans, some of them may be claiming refugee status, but in terms of the people fleeing from Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan and other hot spots like that, a lot of them, well, the big destination is Turkey, simply because of geography. And then the next step, if they have the opportunity, Germany is a big favorite, but you have to get there.
So when you approach your classes with your students, what types of immigration issues are they concerned with that they talk about most or ask about most?
Oh, I wouldn't say there's any one particular question, but you know, we are living in an age of migration. As Ann said, there are very, very high numbers of immigrants right now. Something like over 230 million people in the world are in transit. And that includes people who are, again, moving for voluntary reasons, a lot of the push and pull factors. Some of the push factors we could argue as to whether or not that's leaving voluntarily, leaving as a refugee, and so on.
Right, sure.
And then the people who are leaving involuntarily. And I think refugees would typically be included in that number. And those people are truly, you know, fleeing persecution, a well-founded fear of persecution.
And that's the inevitable migration. They have to leave. They would probably face death or starvation.
Right. Yes.
Where they are. They
Precisely.
can't provide for their family.
And that's why some 4 million people have left Syria in the last 4 years.
I can't imagine what they would go through.
Incredible, incredible.
The cost, emotional and political costs when they get into the lines that are invisible that they can't seem to get into.
But I don't know if you all have seen, I'm sure you have, the pictures of Medea, right, in Syria, where there was a town was under siege and 100 people had starved to death. Pictures of people just haven't eaten in months. You know, if that's what you're dealing with, if that's what you're facing in your home country, absolutely it's involuntary. Because what are they going to do? They either die or they leave.
So when they come to the United States, what's the first thing an immigrant has to face to become legal? What steps do they have to take?
Well, it depends on how they get here. If you're talking about a refugee and they arrive on refugee status, which means they have legal status, and it's a couple of years before they can get a green card, assuming that they're crime-free. And it depends if you're talking about a family member that comes, a U.S. citizen petitions for a spouse, then there's financial obligations. The U.S. citizen has to show the U.S. government that they can financially support this person so they don't go on the government dime. So it just depends on the type of category in which the person comes.
And bringing up another sort of hot button issue, at least from a year and a half ago, and I don't know if people are remembering, but we had this surge of unaccompanied minors on the border. So these are children coming mostly from Central America, mostly from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, So they come to the United States. They were not given refugee status before they came. Right now, the UN High Commission on Refugees does not recognize Central Americans as refugees, and therefore the United States also does not recognize them as official legal refugees. However, they are fleeing violence, they're fleeing abuse, they're fleeing crime in their countries. Coming to the United States, they're just crossing the border without permission. They're not being sponsored by their family members. They're not being, they weren't given that refugee status at first. And they, once they cross the border, they're almost instantly caught by Border Patrol because there are so many Border Patrol along the border. But in their particular case, for the children, that's okay because they know once they're caught by the Border Patrol, they know that they'll be given a chance to apply for asylum. And asylum is their chance to prove that they would suffer persecution if they would return to their country. Now, most of them don't get asylum because our asylum laws are very strict, and they, for many legalities that have to do with asylum, they often don't actually qualify for it. But that's their dream, that's their hope when they're crossing the border, is that they will be able to get that asylum.
What happens to children? And the reason this, I ask this is I lived in Colorado for a few years, and my husband's office was next to a Swift plant. Mm-hmm. And the trucks came in with ice, and the buses took the parents away, and the children were left in school not knowing where their parents were. And the parents were sent to Texas for some handling, and the children were left parentless in the towns in Colorado. And
that same thing happened here in Postville.
And Marshalltown,
a
couple of times.
6 years ago, 7 years ago. Nobody seems to consider that when they snatch up the parents. The government doesn't consider that, which is really very unfortunate.
Is the government, local or state or national, then required to house or educate or feed these children that come in?
Well, I can just speak about what happened in Postville. And in Postville, members of the community came to assistance. Other families that weren't arrested came to assistance. You know, I was at the church where hundreds of people took refuge during that time. And, you know, I saw the desperation, and it was not nice. And anybody that, you know, this is on Sunday morning, if they're religious at all, if they're Christian at all, and they go up and see that kind of suffering, then they might think twice about this hardline stance that a
cruel.
lot have. Yeah.
I volunteered in Colorado. It must have been happening around the same time in the United States with immigration at the Swift plants. And I held a child all night that couldn't stop screaming for fear of not knowing its parents and where its next meal. And it was just so heartbreaking.
So when I talk about the willful blindness, as we talked about earlier, we don't have a legal system that can address these issues. Our legal system now is arrest and detain for the most part. We don't worry about, when I say we, the American government really doesn't concern itself with the consequences of that. Recently, you know, we had this DREAM Act that came into effect maybe 2 or 3 years ago.
DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals.
And that
right?
gave some benefit to young children that came here with their families when they were very young, you know, when they had no say in it and have had no legal status. And so there were several, I'd say tens of thousands of kids that came when they were young that are able and now do have somewhat of legal status.
It's called deferred action, so it's a temporary status. It's not residency, it doesn't lead to citizenship, but it does protect some of our young people who are in high school and college.
So they fall into a more protective, guided category,
Yeah.
but it's not a
President
finality.
Obama tried to do some things unilaterally, and of course our constitutional system doesn't allow unilateral action, and so his actions have been stuck in the courts for the last couple of years, and the big case is going to be heard this term by the United States Supreme Court as to whether or not what President Obama did with these kind of programs is legal.
Right.
Well, we're supposed to be looking at the ethical perspectives of all this, and whether you're a religious person or not, is it ethical and how we have these attitudes, or how we have the lack of action or actions in our behaviors to address some of these issues.
Well, I often see small acts of civil disobedience when the people know that it's illegal to help some undocumented person, but they'll do it anyway.
Well, I know it's clearly very easy to criticize existing laws and particular cases. However, the fact of the matter is 20% of the world's immigrants come to the United States. We are by far the largest receiving country of any country in the world. And in addition, we have fairly open borders. That's part of globalization, actually, is that countries are, to some extent, losing control of their borders. And in this day and age, this age of terrorism, that makes people anxious.
Well, that's not a bad thing that the United States attracts the number that you said.
I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm saying then, at some point, I believe, you do have to draw a line. I mean, I don't propose that we just throw open borders. We are members of states. We are citizens. We are part of the social contract. We have responsibilities to the state has responsibilities to us. Our state can tax us. No other entity in the world can do that. And people elsewhere in the world are not paying taxes to our state. So, we are part of a state, and we may choose or may have to leave our state. But I think we're living in some kind of dream world if we think that state borders don't matter.
Well, I don't think anybody's suggested to put up the borders and let everybody in. The problems that I've been addressing are the 12 million people that are here. We can't pretend that they're not here. And the laws, I think everybody will agree that the laws that we have now aren't working.
So it's multi-layered. We have people coming in. We have people already here. We have children of different status than their parents, perhaps. And
Very much so.
It sounds like we're just not equipped to address that as a country at this time, as things have increased in the world.
We have conflicting laws as well. The U.S. is a signatory to the UN Convention, actually not the convention, the Protocol for Refugees from 1967. And one of the things we've promised to do, and all the countries who have signed on to that protocol have promised to do, is that if a person comes to your country who would face persecution by their government or by a force their government cannot control, were they to return to their country, that we have a responsibility. This is something we have agreed to do. We have a responsibility to not repatriate, forcibly repatriate them to their
You're
countries.
speaking as
The U.S. government.
The
United States government, exactly.
Right.
As do all countries. Now, of course, in the case of Syria, most Syrians are not here in the United States yet. They're getting to Greece and Turkey and places like that, Jordan. So, then it becomes Jordan and Turkey and Greece's responsibility, if they are signatories to that protocol, to not repatriate those migrants, those refugees. Now, does that mean that they can actually take on all those cases themselves? Jordan certainly can't. I don't think the other countries really have the ability to do that. That's where the world has to step in.
Right. I mean, the fact of the matter is, in terms of especially refugee flows, where it's just helter-skelter people leaving quickly, they often go immediately to neighboring states, which may be just about as bad shape as they are. They're often areas with a lot of strife and political instability, and they've already got problems of their own, and then they're overwhelmed by, Jordan's a small country, and they're overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. And then these people, for the most part, they're put into refugee camps in lots of places, where they wait, they apply for asylum. If you apply for asylum in the United States, it's probably going to take about 18 months to get approved.
Or if you get placed in proceedings in Iowa, so if you're not approved in your first application and you get placed in immigration proceedings here in Iowa right now, you're looking at 4 or 5 years.
What happens in the meantime? Where is that person in limbo?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Some lucky ones are able to get work permits, but many, many are not able to get work permits, which means they're living here. They're in legal status because they have a pending application. They absolutely have permission to be here until their application is decided, but they have no way to maintain themselves.
And then I'm thinking health care and education.
Yep, they don't have any of that
all the
either.
costs to and it sounds like it's a great cost to the local counties or the states, but it's also a cost to us as individuals if we don't respond somehow. They're in limbo.
And it's a cost to our economy. Many of these refugees Some refugees come to us suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome and other things like that. But many of these refugees would be a wonderful economic boon for us if they could work. Many of them come with many talents. Many of them come with education, but they're not given that chance.
The ones who are fleeing to Europe, because Europe is taking a lot of the Syrian refugees. Well, first of all, European countries are deciding exactly which government benefits they're going to give. But usually they get housing for a couple of months, and they're finding really that people find jobs pretty quickly and start learning German and assimilate rather well.
And then they accommodate into the culture and
But one ideal is that they don't go and move permanently, that in fact when things will settle down in their home country, that they would want to return, because most people don't want to flee their country.
Right. The human spirit is full of hope and resiliency, but some of these conditions are things I'm glad I haven't had to experience much in life.
Yes.
We have a quick closing. What would be a final comment you would like to challenge our audience with?
I guess I would start with, in this very political time, this should not be a partisan issue. This is not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. This is a humanitarian issue. It's also an economic issue. And I think both parties need to be stepping up and figuring out how we can fix our immigration law, not just keep them out, not just build a wall, but fix our situation.
For those coming in and those already
For those
here.
coming in and for those who are here, exactly.
And I would agree, and I think part of that fixing is so that people have a sense, especially people who are nervous about it, that they have a sense that the U.S. government is not losing control of our borders. Again, in this age of terrorism, that's an outsized fear, granted, and maybe not a reasonable fear, but it's a real fear. Mm-hmm. And so people have to feel that they're being protected by their government and that we're not going to have terrorists slip in.
Right. Not all immigrants are enemies.
Oh, certainly not.
Very, if any.
And not all terrorists are immigrants.
No.
Yes, correct. Right. What are you?
Well, I think there's two issues. The first issue is, what do we do with the 12 million people that are here in the United States? And I think a completely different issue is, what do we do about people that want to come? And I share Lynda's concerns about the free flow of people without some kind of background checks, criminal checks, terrorism checks. But my concern, I think what the concern should be immediately is what do we do with all of the people that are here, that want to be legal, that want to contribute economically, be part of the community?
I think when I hear those kinds of questions asked, I have to ask myself, what are the values that make America strong? And are we using those in this type of a situation? Or are we operating on a fear of scarcity of resources for our own people and to keep the outsider out, and the fear that you mentioned?
Generally, when people act out of fear, positive things don't happen. Positive things don't result.
We're an abundant country, and we have so much that we can share in resource. It's not always through the legal system only.
And some of what we can share also is trying to make life more livable back in people's home countries.
Precisely.
So they don't have to come in the first place.
Precisely. Unfortunately, we are not apt to do that.
Right.
We're much more ready to use our military when problems arise rather than to send humanitarian aid or development aid.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about this morning, and I thank you so much for your contributions and for your many efforts between working through the church services and the legal system and through education. You really represent some good things for us. I want to thank you for joining us this morning, and to thank the Interreligious Council for hosting and putting together and producing this important discussion. And I challenge you to live ethically, especially concerning immigration. Thank you, and have a good day.